I'm not a best-selling author, and I'm not like a critically acclaimed author, someone who, is going to win the MacArthur Prize or whatever. So it's easy for people. There are people who have a tendency to do that comparison game. Oh, if only I had this, or I want what that person has. One thing that being around a long time teaches you is partly a sense of perspective, but also sometimes that just continuing is a form of success. Just, people need to take breaks sometimes, but it's like, if you're going to run a marathon and you have to walk a couple times, during the marathon, if you finish the race, you finished it. If you keep going, you're going to be closer than you were if you stopped here. And in my case, just still writing, still publishing, still having readers, that's a big deal. A lot of people can't say that. And at any point, I could have, fallen off the wagon and not been able to get back on. So that in itself that's what the perspective gives you, is to say, first of all, this is success. It's success to still be writing.
What is up, everybody? You're listening to episode 158 of SFF Addicts. I'm your host, Adrian M. Gibson, and welcome to your weekly dive into the world of science fiction, fantasy, and writing craft. Joining me this week is my co-host, my bestie from the Midwestie, the queen of my days, Greta Kelly. How you doing, Greta?
Good. How are you doing, Adrian?
Doing fantastic. And just, God, this flashy copy of
the baby.
Yeah, it's real. It's real.
It exists.
Days by Greta Kelly. Go buy this book for some fun heist action and support Greta's children.
Yeah. And of course, go check out Adrian's book, Baby Mushroom Blues, is out now for your daily dose of murder, mystery, and of course, mushrooms. Anywhere you buy books, right? Just about.
And pretty much anywhere.
Yeah.
And if it's not there, you can generally order it. So it's okay.
Yeah.
And support MJ, our other co-host who's not here today. Go get her novel Among Thieves, which is the book one in the Tales of Tomorrow duology. If you want to support her and help her quit her day job and feed her cat, that would be very lovely. And thank you all so much. As well, a quick note for listeners, you can support SFF Addicts on Patreon for a ton of cool extras like bonus episodes, author readings, and more. So check the links in the description to support what we do here. Also, don't forget to rate and review the podcast on your favorite podcast app and subscribe to the FanFiAddict YouTube channel where this and every other episode of the show is available in full video. And now welcoming to SFF Addicts for the first time, the wonderful Kate Elliott, award-winning author whose expansive career runs the gamut from fantasy epics like the Crown of Stars series to space operas like the Sun Chronicles. And her latest book, The Witch Roads, is out today. Welcome, Kate. How are you doing?
Thank you. I'm doing well and excited to be here. Excited to find more books for my TBR. the endless adding pile. Yeah. But isn't that a good thing though?
Yes.
Would we want to have a finite list? Was like, I ran out. Now what do I do?
That's a dark day. Let's not even think about it.
Yeah.
I mean, I hope that doesn't come. If all the paper in the world just decided to fuck off and then we're all like, I mean, ebooks would still be around. But still.
Ebooks would still be around. And then the libraries and the books that we may have that we haven't read yet. Not that we're supposed to admit that, but I do have many books I haven't read yet.
How dare you call me out like this?
It's like
all those classics I haven't even touched.
Oh my gosh, yeah. I have 3 kids who are all adults now, and my eldest is like, Mom, have you read Moby Dick yet? And I'm like, oh my gosh, I feel like I'm being called out by my own spawn, as I call them. So yeah.
He's like, Mom, you're a writer. Shame.
No, really.
Before we dig deeper into the episode, a quick word from our sponsor. Welcome to Transference, where death and sickness are but a distant memory. Nicholas Five Burrows is a sicko. someone that takes on others' illnesses. In a city where diseases can be transferred, the rich buy longer lives without pain, and the poor get a short life of constant sickness. Brought back from the brink of death by his friend Brian Meadowhearth, or maybe the invisible hand of an outside actor, Nick finally gets the chance to try and change things, to finally stop the whole disease transfer network. Tensions escalate as Nick infiltrates a higher society he doesn't understand, and starts to fall for Dorothy Sungate, the very person he needs to manipulate to be successful. And between run-ins with a talking cat, genetically modified humans, and a robotic police force, the world around him just keeps getting stranger. Can Nicholas tear down the disease transfer architecture? And how much of his humanity is he willing to bargain along the way? A dystopian vision of healthcare and a market economy, Transference will appeal to fans of Red Rising, Blade Runner, and the BioShock franchise. Soon to be a complete duology with the release of Transcendence in the summer of 2025. Transference by Ian Patterson is available now in paperback and ebook. Get your copy today. And now, enjoy the rest of this episode of SFF Addicts. Oh, we're starting this episode off with shame, but Kate, just for anyone who isn't aware of you, your work, if you can tell them a little bit more about yourself.
Oh, this is my least favorite question.
Other than the fact that you haven't read Moby Dick, of course.
I haven't read Moby Dick. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Oh, that's just like flattened me now. I can't even go on. But anyway, I'm one of those people who started writing as a child and in my case, being a kind of geeky, dorky person, I was drawing maps and underground complexes. I don't even know why, I just did. And then I started writing stories to go with them or stories to not go with them. And I just never stopped. And somehow parlayed that into making a kind of a living with it. And I've been publishing for over 30 years. So I feel incredibly fortunate. I have written, as you said, a reader of mine created what she calls the Kate Elliott bingo card. And it has things that you could expect to find in a Kate Elliott novel. And it's really funny and really clever. So I do have a kind of a Kate Elliott book, but I also write across many, many different subgenres. So I have written kind of epic space opera, epic fantasy. I've written 2 novellas. I've written 2 Magic the Gathering stories. I've written a couple of first-person novels. One of them is a young adult story about an athletic girl, but in a kind of a I call that one's the one I call Little Women, American Ninja Warrior meets Little Women in a country inspired by Cleopatra's Egypt. Is that not the best pitch line? Anyway, I'm really bad at pitches, but I like that one.
Is that not niche enough for you?
Is that yeah, that is so, yeah. Anyway, that's me. Alternate fantasy, alternate history only with, anyway, it goes on and on like that. So I like to move around kind of within all the options and opportunities there are in the science fiction fantasy field, which is such a huge field. I think the only thing I haven't written is horror. And I think The Witch Roads probably has some of the grimmest material because of the fungus thing, the magical fungus thing that I guess we'll talk about in a little bit. But but at the same time, there are certain things that will tend to show up in a novel I've written because they just reflect me. And I think that's one of the things, we'll probably touch on this again later, because one of the questions, you guys so kindly sent me a list of questions, things to think about. One of them is, are there any trends you see coming for publishing that excite or worry you? And when I think about this idea of using Chat GPT to write a novel, all I can think of is why? Why? Why do I need something scraped and imitated when I can have what people write? So each of us will write something. We could be given the same prompt and we would each write something completely different because it comes through us, through our experiences and the way our brains work and what we're interested in. And that's the beauty of art for me.
I completely agree. Because if
Yeah.
you're using like ChatGPT, it's like you're taking out the one thing that actually matters, which is like the soul of the individual
Yeah.
creator.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Well, when you were growing up and making all your maps, were there any books or movies, TV shows, or even games that you really looked to and just got you hooked on science fiction and fantasy?
Well, I will say that I'm like an old school Lord of the Rings dork. I read that in 8th grade and I really imprinted on it. Not in the sense that I wanted to write a copy of Lord of the Rings, because I never wanted to. I've never been someone who wanted to write something that is like something I read, but I wanted to write something that would evoke in readers the feelings I felt in the larger sense, not exactly the same feelings, but that people would read that and go, oh my gosh, oh, I feel so, whatever. Um, I wanted to try to accomplish that. The only thing as a teenager, though, that I really did wish, like when my family did a lot of camping, like so if we'd be out in the woods and I would see like two trees that kind of went like this, and I would think, oh, what if I just step through that portal? When you're 14, you think about these things, right? And I could
I still
find
think
myself
about
in
these
Middle
things.
Earth, right? So it never worked out as far as I know. If it did, they wiped my memory.
I mean, you never
So
got your camping portal fantasy, but you wrote your own books, so that's its own version
right,
of a portal
right,
fantasy.
right. So I always say Lord of the Rings, also Martian Chronicles by Ray Bradbury had a big effect on me in again in that 13, 14-year-old range. And then in high school, I discovered, I would say the other two would be Jane Austen, who's a huge favorite of mine, and Ursula K. Le Guin, who was incredibly inspiring writer because of the nature of how she looks at the world and what she focuses on. And she taught me a lot about how we can change the focus of what, especially when I was young, the kind of stories that I loved to read were so focused. They were usually about men. Women tended to have very secondary roles. And look, and there were always a certain kind of person that stories would often, not always, focus on, or at least the stories I liked. And Le Guin said it doesn't have to be that way. We can look at things differently, and we can look at different people, and we can have them be the point of view or the eyes of our story, and different activities that are just as important to be in narrative, not just sword fighting and the king sitting on the throne. So I would say those four. I mean, there's more. There aren't really just those four. Like probably every book I've ever written has influenced me in some manner or another, for good or for ill, who knows?
Yeah.
Right. But those are the big four.
The fundamental ones, and they're very good fundamentals.
Those are
Yeah.
great
For
ones.
me,
Yeah.
yeah.
And I mean, like as you mentioned earlier, you've been in this for a long time. Your first book, The Labyrinth Gate, came out in 1988, which is kind of just like crazy to think about. I was telling
I'm
my wife
really
about
old. Let me just
you don't
assure
look it.
you.
You
Well,
do not look it.
yeah, one way or
Whoever's
another.
listening
Yeah,
audio,
that's
go check out the YouTube.
but yeah, no, but yeah, it's true. I've been writing a long time.
But what first sparked your desire? I mean, like obviously those writers and books you mentioned are huge, but what else kind of fed into your desire to write and to get into publishing?
I don't know. I don't think. Why does anybody do anything? I mean, why do some kids draw clothes and decide to become fashion designers? Why do some people obsessively play an instrument? Why do some people tinker with car motors and like to take things apart and put them back together again? I guess I just respond well to the written word. It's a really great way for me to process. So written language. So I gravitated to that. And I suppose in a way, writing stories allowed me to have the adventures, especially as a teenager, that I grew up in rural Oregon. So there wasn't a lot going on. I mean, of course, there was a lot going on because it was farm country, and that's a crucial thing in the world, food. But, you know, it's like, what if I could be out in space, going off to visit far stars or whatever? I had that kind of mind. And so to some extent, writing was a way for me not to put myself in those stories, but to write those stories. So as if, I was experiencing them with other people or, things like that.
I mean, I grew up in rural British Columbia, so I know
Yeah,
exactly
I grew up in
how you
rural
feel.
Wisconsin, so
There we go. It's the rural.
farm kids unite.
We're all rural kids, farm kids. Makes it sound like I don't know, like the Goonies or something.
I'll take
Oh,
it.
the Goonies is way too suburban. But
No, and actually one of the funniest things to me is coming into the science fiction fantasy community, there's some kinds of discussions that people would have. And I would be like, what are they talking about? And I finally came to realize that a fair number of people weren't even urban. They were suburban. A lot of writers are suburban. And that is, as you two know, not our experience of growing up. It's really different. Rural is very different from suburban.
it's like I
Yeah.
need to like bike like 30 minutes to go to my friend's house.
Yeah.
I remember
Yeah.
the days.
And that's close. Good old days.
Well, with all this experience that you have behind you, I mean, how has the business changed since you first started out? Does it seem like it's a different landscape completely?
Well, of
or-
course, it is in a lot of ways. There can be what I would call the mechanical ways, which was, when I started out, you couldn't email your manuscript. You had to print everything out and send it. You could email, like it was the early days of email, but they didn't have enough capacity to send anything, right? So I've watched that entire process happen. When they could start sending things, and my first computer had an external hard drive that was huge. It had 20 megabytes. I remember thinking, how can I ever fill all this up?
I will never use all this
I will
data.
never use that.
I will never use this all up. Yeah,
Now we have like a single image is like 20 megabytes. easy.
exactly.
Oh
And
my
if it's
God.
35, then they'll say, hey, this is kind of large. Can you like use a different way of, transporting this? I don't know. So it was kind of expensive back in the day. It's not that there's always a lot of barriers to writing for different people for different reasons. But one barrier to writing back in the day was that you had to photocopy or type it a second time, or use a carbon copy, type it with a carbon copy, because you're not going to send your only copy in the world into the mail off to a publisher. Because what happens if it vanishes? Then it's gone. So you have to have a copy. So printing things out, the paper to type on, all these things cost money. And that was a barrier for people if you couldn't afford that. And everything took a lot longer, which in some ways now I think of as maybe a good thing. Things weren't running at this same like pace of like constant, everything can be done tomorrow if you just would work all night. And the demographics have changed, way more. The demographics of the United States, for example, I'll just use that as the example, have changed a lot since I was young, for the better, which means that to a certain extent, not as much as it should, but to a great extent, the demographics of science fiction fantasy have changed for the better. We get a much wider range of people writing about, with a wider range of experience, a wider range of ways they're focusing on what they're writing about and what interests them. And that has been phenomenal. When people talk about, they used to talk about the golden age of science fiction was the 1940s or 50s. But frankly, I find most of that to be kind of provincial and narrow compared to what I can read today. I can read just a wider range of things. That also means that there's more crossover today. There's less pigeonholing. So if you want to write a heist, right? Something that's a heist with a fantasy background, back in the day, that would have been like, oh, is that a mystery or a fantasy novel? We don't know. There's too much love story in this. That's like kind of too romancy. And now romancy is the big deal. So there's a lot of mixing and matching now. Everything, you can just throw everything in. Nobody cares anymore. My favorite example of this is young adult, of course, has had this huge impact on the publishing field, in large part because of Twilight and Hunger Games. So they just exploded the market. And back in the day, only literary niche novels used first person present tense or third person present tense. That was considered a kind of a like, oh, that's very literary. It's hard to read. Nobody wants to do that. Well, it's everywhere now. Nobody even thinks twice about it. In the Sun Chronicles, this big space opera, 2 of the 3 novels are out, that I use third person past tense, third person present tense, and first person present tense interchangeable. I mean, different, each point of view is one way, but I use all 3 of those points of view in a novel. 20 years ago, I would have been told to regularize it, but nobody cares now because the readers will adapt instantly to anything.
And I do know some readers who are very particular about that kind of thing, where they're like, "Oh, I don't like third person present tense, for instance."
Right.
But then again, that's just a particular reader taste, as opposed to the adaptability as readers as a whole. That there are going to be a lot of people who are like, "Yeah, I'm in on this. Let's go. This is really great."
Well,
it doesn't necessarily have to be so. Like, I look at one of my literary idols, like Jeff Vandermeer, and he's like, I don't give a fuck about form. Like, I'm just gonna like you see a novel like Dead Astronauts, and it's like experimentation, literature within sci-fi and fantasy these days is just beyond what anyone could have expected, right? And it's so beautiful.
Yeah, it's now it doesn't now have to go outside science fiction. It's a big tent, and the tent keeps getting bigger, and I think that is great for the health of the genre. And there's a lot of crossover into mainstream now. In fact, I would say science fiction fantasy is mainstream now in a way that it absolutely was not when I was younger. There were very few. I remember going to see one particularly, it was really bad fantasy movie in the theaters. It was like a B-list or a B- list film. But I went to see it because that was all there was. But now, how many TV shows have a fantastical element or a science fictional element? And everybody's watching them.
Yeah. It really is amazing. And I think TV and film has helped sci-fi and fantasy really reach beyond what just publishing, what just books could do. Because especially now, like, so many people, it's like, you read a book, or are you gonna get your whatever like yearly Netflix subscription or something like that,
Right.
I think it is a little bit easier for people to justify, be like, well, I'm gonna get all my entertainment from this avenue. Which is like why it's so sad to see some of those statistics about American reading habits, and it's like less than 50% of people read at least one book a year, and it's like, oh my god, this is.
But I think that was always
horrifying,
kind of true of the U.S. Actually,
Yeah.
I don't think the U.S. was ever
a book country.
A book country in the same way that I'm gonna say maybe Europe was. I may be wrong, but
let us know in the comments. Let us know what
like,
you
if you have any.
How many books a year do you read? I'll be very curious what people
Our very
have to say.
skewed audience.
Our very, very skewed
Yeah,
audience,
yeah.
right? This is not a good
Not a sample set.
sample pool, but whatever.
And then I wanted to say, the other thing I wanted to say, which we touched on before we started, was this whole Chat GPT AI thing, which to me is, there are, I wish, first of all, I wish they would have come up with a different name than AI, which is a bad
I think the word intelligence
description.
is far, far too loaded.
Yeah, it's too loaded. Large language models. But anyway, let's call it AI because that's what we got. There's a lot of really good uses for it. As the medical field is one where it's shown real promise in finding patterns and helping discover cancer at its earliest stages, because it can see things in a more finely grained than the human eye can, and then it can go to an experienced doctor to read it. But in terms of art, it's just there's just no point, because it's merely there. It exists to monetize art. It's not there for art's sake. You're not writing a novel with AI for art. You're doing it because you can think you make money off of it. And that creates art as it's just another consumer product. And I know that's always been an issue in a capitalistic system. But people still write with the hope of, for themselves, and maybe also with the hope of making money. But they are creating art. AI can't create art. It can only create a product. And
it is really difficult these days because of the way that like self-publishing works.
Yeah.
So it's like those who poo-pooed self-publishing in the earlier days, because there was just like a wave of people who were like cheap covers, quick story, blah blah blah. That is now happening again, but with AI, GPT and different AI tools being used to be like, okay, well, I'm gonna like pump out 10 romance novels or like 10 lit RPG novels in a year, and it's like, oh my god,
it's terrible. Horrible. And you see it like every other day on social media, another like author getting caught with their pants down because they left the AI edits in the text.
Yeah.
Oh, I saw that. It's just like
the prompts, like they left the prompts in there. It's like, come on.
But the thing about the indie publishing, which is another big, huge change, because that was driven by people, obviously, who couldn't get published through traditional publishing and who were actually writing things people wanted to read, but which traditional publishing, which is a little more rigid in its ideas, couldn't see how to market or didn't, whatever, And it was because technology changed that they were able to self-publish. But that was driven by the people writing. But it wasn't driven by the tech bros saying, we want to make money off this. And so far we aren't. So we could just sell it to you, find some way to sell it to you. And then, but you're right. Who knows what's going to happen with that?
It is a very strange place to be in. And obviously, like I see so many of our fellow authors out there, even readers, just people in the community who are just kind of burnt out by this wave of AI and AI tools, and the publishers who are using AI for covers, the authors who are using AI for stories, and just all across the board, everyone's like, I'm fucking exhausted of this shit, and it's just another thing. I mean, this industry is very, very difficult to begin with. Add on top of that all of these extra stressors and stuff like that, which is why I was really like impressed by your candor and honesty at the beginning of The Witch Rose, where it's like your dedication to this was basically to all the people who get burnt out and who feel like they might want to quit, right?
Absolutely.
And that you yourself considered quitting, but this duology like reignited your love for the craft. So do you want to talk a little bit more about this, about like burnout and persistence, honestly?
Yeah. One of the, I'm not a best-selling author, and I'm not like a critically acclaimed author, someone who, is going to win the MacArthur Prize or whatever. So it's easy for people. There are people who have a tendency to do that comparison game. Oh, if only I had this, or I want what that person has. One thing that being around a long time teaches you is partly a sense of perspective, but also sometimes that just continuing is a form of success. Just, people need to take breaks sometimes, but it's like, if you're going to run a marathon and you have to walk a couple times, during the marathon, if you finish the race, you finished it. If you keep going, you're going to be closer than you were if you stopped here. And in my case, just still writing, still publishing, still having readers, that's a big deal. A lot of people can't say that. And at any point, I could have, fallen off the wagon and not been able to get back on. So that in itself that's what the perspective gives you, is to say, first of all, this is success. It's success to still be writing. And the other thing that having been around a long time gives me truly, truly, is such a powerful sense of, where does art come from? We don't even know. It's just, we know that the evidence suggests that humans have been doing art for even before they were Homo sapiens, before, proto-humans. There seems to be some evidence among Neanderthals of things that have to do with, that we might call artistic, leaving flowers with someone in a grave, right? The remains of flowers. There's something there that's more than just, mechanistic living. And so wherever it comes from, one of that art is a journey, just like life is a journey. And it's kind of a cliche, but it's also true. So if you look at someone who says, well, I'm young, and will I ever have an artistic life? Is it too late for me because I'm 25 and I haven't published yet? And I'm like, you have your whole life. I mean, no one knows how long they're going to live, but you have your whole life. And what you write at the beginning and what you write 10 years later and what you write 20 years after that, it's all going to be part of you, but it's also going to change over time. So if you ever get a chance to go to a retrospective of, say, a visual artist's work, there's a famous sculptor and artist here in Hawaii named Satoru Abe, who just died 2 years, died in 2023, I think. He did art his whole life. He was doing new stuff in his 90s, like experimenting with new forms, doing painting that looks nothing like what he did in his 20s. And they have a retrospective of him at the Honolulu Museum of Art. And it is just phenomenal to go through that. But it's also important to artists and writers, anyone who's making art, to say, I have a whole lifetime to explore what art means to me and what I have to say. And if I could say anything to people, is don't think about small frame. Don't think about short term. Think about short term where you need to, but think about all the time you have to explore what art means to you and what you're going to do, because you don't know what you're going to be doing in 20 years or 30 years. Hopefully still be alive, right? But it could be something new, something amazing, something expected, something the same. We don't know. And I am bothered by the idea when people say, well, they've been, doing art for a while, they should just, retire. Well, there is no retiring from art. Bach, Johann Sebastian Bach famously died while he was composing Art of the Fugue. I think not literally on the page, but, he was in the middle of composing it in his 80s. So what an amazing thing that we can do this all our lives and have it be the same and yet constantly changing. Anyway, that's my spiel about that.
No, I love
No,
that.
it's beautiful. I look at the first, I was a tattoo artist for 7 years, and I looked at the first tattoo I did and the last ones that I did. I mean, I'm still tattooing here and there, but I'm just like, oh my God, my first ones are just terrible. But it's all about
the
perspective.
ability
It's
to
all
see
about progress and the ability to understand that change and improvement is this slowly accruing process. It's this process of experimentation. It's a process of learning.
Yeah.
It's a process of communication, all these different things. And I'm like, yeah, even though my first tattoos were shit, I'm still really proud that I did them.
You started and you kept going.
I started.
You
I kept
started,
going.
and
Same
weren't they
thing
the
with writing.
best you could do at that time?
Exactly.
That means
That's it.
something.
Yeah.
It's, I mean, if it, Labyrinth Gate, I would not call that the best novel. I can see all the issues.
It would be
with
really
it now.
interesting for someone to read the Witch Roads and then go back and read the Labyrinth Gate. That would be very interesting.
It would be interesting.
Yeah.
You could see what elements show up,
Yeah.
and what don't, and but that's part of that's part of the joy of it, and that's why I don't want people to sell themselves short. And that's the other thing about AI that bothers me, this Chat GPT thing, is you're actually cheating yourself. People who use it are cheating themselves because they can't improve. And why do this if you can't improve? For me anyway, that's half of the joy of it, is to say, whoa, that really was good. I couldn't have done that 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Or even just like from one book to the next.
From one book
One
to the
story
next.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
we have to talk more about the Witch Roads, because it's such a fun book. But for anyone in the audience who hasn't like heard about it yet, or obviously it's just coming out today, so give us the elevator pitch for it so we get the people out to buy it.
I'm sorry to tell you this, but I do not have an elevator pitch for the Witch Roads. Boy, this is like, so this thing happened, and that's my elevator pitch. So this is a story. I say a lot. I can say a couple things about this. I coined the term just to annoy my eldest. As you can see, I like to annoy my eldest, and my eldest likes to annoy me. It's great. I coined the term grim suite for this book, which means the setting is kind of grim, but the relationships are not all of them, but the relationships are mostly very positive. And it has kind of a sweet love story in it. It's a story about a humble deputy courier with a mysterious and actually quite traumatic past, who, in order to save her nephew, finagles it so that she and her nephew get assigned to guide a obnoxious prince across the backcountry. He has some mysterious mission, probably related to palace intrigue. And I wrote this story in part. I mean, there's a lot of reasons I write story. My process of creating, of where novels come from, is very long. I don't like sit down and say, oh, I need to write a romantasy now. I need 2 love interests and a setting and a problem that keeps them apart. I don't work like that. I'll have things kind of bubble up in my head, and I'll write them down, and I might write, 5,000 words of an opening and then set it aside. And then a year and a half later, come back and say, oh, that part isn't working anymore. Let me try it this way, and then eventually. And so this book comes out of like about 3 or 4 years of me poking around some kind of a central idea. But one of the things I wanted to do was to write a novel from the point of view of someone of humble background who sees all these things of the higher ups. So instead of writing about the palace intrigue from inside the palace, from all the higher ups, you see it from the point of view of someone who's never going to be directly involved in the sense that they're going to be part of the machinations, or that they're going to ever have any benefit from them, but that they get kind of attached to it. Not a good place to be, in my opinion, because if you're low, if it's a status driven society, and this is, and you're low status, you're discardable, because that's how those societies work. And then the other aspect, of course, that's so important in this story is that the story itself, that the setting, the world itself, has kind of a hidden past. And that has kind of emerged in the form of something called the pall, which is this deadly mist, and its offshoot spore, which one of my writing group called a ravenous fungal ghost plague.
Awesome.
Which is a very good way of
That's
putting
a great
Yes,
description.
I had no idea going into this book that there was going to be like
Right.
a fungal plague kind of thing, and I was just like, okay, well, obviously I wrote a book called
Sold.
Mushroom Blue, so you don't know the mushrooms.
Yeah.
But do you want to tell us a little bit more about that and sort of some elements of the world building? Because I really loved the Paul and the Spore, but there's also
Haunts
things like
and
Holy Stone and these
Mhm.
things called haunts, which is kind of like where you're playing a little bit around with like some horror elements and some creepier elements. So how does all that fit into the world and like the role of magic and everything?
Boy, this is a tough one, because this is one of those things that I'm not sure. Excuse me. I think I have to. I'm almost had to sneeze there. Excuse me. It was probably the spore creeping up on me.
Oh no.
So I didn't really, this whole novel, because of how it happened, which is that I was working, I had just, I can't go into detail about what happened, but I had just finished the second volume of the big space opera, which is like, it's gender swapped Alexander the Great in space. And it is big ticket space opera, cast of thousands, super long books. So I had turned in the second one in, and some things happened that made me actually genuinely think I should just quit. I've had some rough stuff happen across my career. And one of the things I've done is I've just kept working. I picked myself up and kept working. And this was the first time I ever thought that maybe, what was the point? I was so discouraged. And I think I didn't write for several weeks or a month, which is quite unusual for me, because even if I'm not working on my specific project, on deadline, contracted project, I will be poking at these other things because I always have something. I have multiple things churning around. I mean, you guys know how that is, right? We could write for 100 years and never run out of ideas. But so at that time, I thought, well, I could either stop, or why don't I just work on this thing? This thing kind of vaguely interests me. So I wrote pretty much that opening sequence with Ellen and her nephew. And it wasn't on contract. I hadn't written, and there was I'm not really an outliner. I'm more of like an architectural writer. So I have an idea of the framework, but I had nothing. I just started, this is interesting. And so actually some of this stuff I was literally just making up as I went, which for me was very freeing. But it was also tied in with stuff that I had already written 3 years ago. So I was pulling from that back burner into it. So it was a kind of a different process for me. And I thought, well, I'm kind of enjoying this. I'll write another chapter. And then it would be like, no, I should go back and work on book 3, but I couldn't. I would flinch when I thought about book 3. And you can't write when you flinch like that. So I thought, well, I can either write nothing out of a sense of duty for the book that's under contract, or I can write something. And then after 3 months, after a month, I'll have something or I'll have nothing. And it's better to have something in that case, in my opinion. So I kept writing, and then the book just took off. It was just like a grand piano landed in my brain. And I wrote like 240,000 words in 5 or 6 months. It just literally, it just poured into me. And that's what became the duology. I had to expand the second half because I had left out things while I was writing it, because I thought it was already so long. I'll skip over that thing I think needs to happen. And then when I did the revisions, I put all those things back in, or I put them in. But, oh my God, I've just gone off on a tangent. And now I forgot what I was answering.
It's a good tangent.
No, it's a great tangent.
I was asking you about the world. And
right. So
it sounds like it was
and Paul.
into,
yeah. So I don't know why I don't know why where the haunt came from. I think it just seemed like a good idea at the time. Mysterious, shadowy, mysterious past. I love mysterious ancient past stuff. It's just like a trope I really enjoy. And then a lot of things started. A lot of stuff happened in my brain. I think that especially with experience, then the more experience we get as writers, I know you guys understand me when I say this, that our brain starts doing a lot of work that we don't have to consciously do up at the very front of it. But when you're in the earlier stages, when you're learning, a lot of that happens like right up front, like right in front of your eyes. But a lot of stuff got put together in the back. So actually my brain was doing a lot of work, but I wasn't necessarily aware of it because things would just kind of click into place. And I've learned to just trust my instincts when that happened. So the other thing that goes in tandem with that is the structure of the world. And I have been watching a lot of Korean and Chinese historical dramas. So to some extent, this isn't like alternate China. It's its own world. But some elements of that palace structure, that focus on the palace as the central place, and then how things structure down from that very much comes out of that East Asian kind of top down and then very layered bureaucracy. So there's a top down rulership and this very layered bureaucracy and very layered status. And the difficulty in some times, not in all times, because, any culture in Europe, you see this too. There are times when rank and position are rigid and times when it's fluid. But this is a more rigid time. And then with the spore, I'm not actually sure where it comes from, because this is an older thing. I actually wrote a short story like 10 years ago that has something that's kind of similar to the pall that had spawned these demonic kind of creature, not demons, that's the wrong, but like these monsters that would, and was always, so it's not that world, but it's that idea. So that's where the pall came from. The spore, I'm not so sure where it came from specifically, but the empire and that grip it has, right? How everything is rigid. And then the fact that there's this toxic, murderous, ravenous fungal ghost plague, they actually went well together, because it turns out you can protect yourself pretty much from that if you institute all these very strict protocols, which
you just
help
parent
the
hard
empire
enough.
control everybody, right? Yeah.
And then it all goes to shit when things don't necessarily work as they should.
Yes.
Well, right. But also the palace intrigue continues regardless.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But I loved it, that dichotomy of like something that is natural and sort of like, it is still a network, it still is a structure, but it's much more like chaotic and
Mm-hmm.
unpredictable, versus something that is essentially like built around trying to combat that thing and keep it away.
Yeah.
Ends up being a different kind of system, structure, network
They're
that is much
exactly.
more rigid.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They're both structures. They're both networks. Yeah.
Yeah. They're kind of like opposite sides of the spectrum, and one of them is trying to control the ways in which the other one infects this world. Is super, super cool.
One of like the other things that I really, really enjoyed about this book was, you mentioned earlier Elle and her relationship with her nephew Kem, because they were like so much like the emotional core of the story seemed to be like those two characters, and I just love them so much. But can you tell our audience a little bit more about that relationship and how you landed on aunt and nephew versus mother and son, and like how did you just make it hit so hard in the feels?
Yeah. So I didn't want to write a mother-son story. I'm not sure why, but it didn't feel appropriate. Sometimes I just go with, that sense. But that sense, like, I don't want to do a mother-son thing, because the dynamic is a little different. I have two boys. I have three kids. Two of them are boys, but I knew I really like family relationships in books, whether it be blood family or found family. I don't care. There was an old trend back in the day of having all these, the lone hero, the orphaned hero. And I understand that sometimes it's too hard to juggle family relationships, but sometimes I felt that it came out of a kind of dismissal of family relationships and the importance of them in people's lives. And, sometimes people are contemptuous of their parents, and sometimes people have good reason to have bad relationships with their parents or their family. There's some kind of trauma or, some real disagreements there. And I don't mean that, but I mean that sense that, well, back in the day, there were certainly a number of male writers who could only write women as someone who gave birth to you, or someone who you could, have sex with, so they could give birth to your child or your son, preferably, right? And so then there's no reason to have much of a relationship with them beyond that. But I really like relationships because we all live in them, all of us. Maybe a few people don't, but it's very rare. So I wanted that. And then I wanted to write, my kids aren't teens anymore, but I have many memories of them being teens, some being great and some not so great, right? That's they go through, it's a process that children go through as they become adults. It's an amazing process to accompany. And it's what I went through myself, right? We all went through that. So I wanted to write a teenager. And then I do get a little tired of a particular kind of YA novel in which the 16-year-olds save the world because they're the best at everything. And, I wanted to write a teenager who is smart, savvy, a problem solver, good at interacting with people, but who's also a teenager in the sense that he still relies on his aunt for things, that first, and he still struggles with, he's not as mature as some of the other people, even though he's very much, even though he is mature, but not as mature. He's not an adult yet. And I just wanted to write that. This doesn't really give anything away, I hope, but one of my favorite scenes is the one where he finally confronts her with this information. Why didn't you tell me about X? And then they have an argument, she doesn't really argue, but he argues with her. And then, and then he says, I hate you, or something like that. And then they're walking, right? Because there's a lot of walking in this story. They're walking, but he doesn't stomp away. He just keeps walking along beside her. And to me, that was like the prime teenage moment. It's like, I hate you, but I want to be close to you.
It's like that.
But there's nowhere safe to storm off to right now.
right. But I don't want to lose you. Yeah.
I can only trudge alongside you on this holy stone.
Right.
But I think it's like this combination of like a teenage stubbornness, but also vulnerability at the same time. It's like stubbornness and pride that we want to be adults, but it's like, you're not an adult yet. There's still so much that you have to learn. Mm-hmm. And you really, really captured that in this book beautifully. And I think just all the interpersonal relationships were fantastic. And obviously you mentioned the obnoxious Prince earlier, Prince Gavilan, who he's so fucking entitled at the beginning of this book.
He's beyond entitled. The world revolves around those people in the palace, right? They don't even think about that. God. But you guys
his first scene, or like one of his first scenes, is like you read that and you're like, okay, this guy does not give a shit about anybody around him. But I think you did such a good job of balancing the various interpersonal relationships, but also like the power dynamics and the status dynamics that you had going on. How did you do that while keeping the momentum going? I mean, obviously there's a lot of walking, so there is that momentum, but just like in general.
That's a tough question to answer because one of the things about having written for a long time is that you kind of pick up a gut level. You kind of gain the experience to say, this is working, this isn't working. And one of the things that I have worked hardest on, one of the things that I've struggled most across my career is pacing. I wrote a 7-volume epic fantasy series, the one called Crown of Stars. And it's like everything in the kitchen sink. It is so filled with stuff. And a lot of people, it's still my most popular series, I think, because epic fantasy is just such a big deal in the SFF field. I would say that parts of it are paced well and parts of it are not paced well. So I learned a lot from writing it. And if I were to write something similar today, it would be paced differently. The second space opera is super long, but I think it has so many characters and so many plot threads and so much going on, which that came out in 2023. That was Furious Heaven. And I think that it is paced pretty well, quite well, actually. I put a lot of that down to having written the young adult fantasy trilogy, which came out in 2015, 16, and 17. That's the Court of Fives. It's the American Ninja Warrior, Little Women, Cleopatra's Egypt one. And one of the reasons I wrote that was because I knew that YA editors would not let me go off on tangents. I knew that they would emphasize pacing. And indeed, they did. They were ruthless editors. They were, and so kind. Oh, we love this 3-page disquisition about the history and background of the royal lineage. Now can you cut it to 1 sentence?
The passive aggressiveness.
Yeah.
It wasn't. They were fantastic. I learned so much doing that I was then able about pacing and about how to keep things moving at a clip, how to end chapters with a good page turner, and how to juggle the way conversations are sitting in and the way scenes function to keep that pace moving. I learned so much from doing that young adult fantasy. You could probably look at my books written before and the ones after and see that my pacing improves after that. And it's not that the books before it are bad at all. I mean, for example, the Spirit Walker trilogy, which is the alt fantasy history one. Oh my God, I have a pitch for that one too, but I forgot it. Anyway, it's first person. It's really funny. It's kind of like a Regency romance, only it's set, there's lawyer dinosaurs and a spirit world and all this stuff going on with a first person heroine who is really funny and kind of reckless. I love that trilogy. Yeah, that starts with Cold Magic. I love that trilogy. But I wrote Court of Fives right after it. And I bet that the pacing is a little different in the two of them because I had to. And then, so I think for me, it's saying I've got to, what is the purpose of this scene? What am I trying to accomplish here? There has to be something going on all the time. So there's 2 characters who it turns out used to be, this isn't really a spoiler. There's 2 characters who used to have a relationship and don't anymore, and they're constantly sniping at each other. That was a situation where as they came up to the ridge, and so first of all, I had a lot of people in the party, and then I cut them down. So I only have like 8, I think. Is it 8 or 9? I can't remember because I couldn't handle, first of all, I said, I can't handle more than this. Nobody can follow more than this. You can't. Otherwise, they're just like someone stumps along and we don't know who they are. They're just a spear carrier. And that didn't work with this book. I knew that this had to be a book about character and character interaction because that's the core of it. And that's something that I can only find out about a book once I start writing it, is when I realize what kind of book am I writing. I'm not a person who sits down and goes, I'm going to write this kind of book now. I find it out as I go. And other people may know beforehand. Who knows, right? But they came up and I said, okay, I need something to differentiate. Something, you start with something easy, right? There's a character in the Sun Chronicles who wears this stupid cap. It's a stupid cap. Everyone knows it's stupid. He knows it's stupid. There's actually a reason he wears it. But that's how I first differentiated him from the others. Then slowly you get to know him better, right? So now you see the personality, and then you start figuring out why he wears that cap, right? But that takes place over hundreds of pages. But at first you know him because he's the guy who wears the stupid cap. So this was the same thing. I thought, well, what could I do to differentiate some of these people? And I thought, wait, 2 of them could be, because this is an easy one. It's a freebie. They used to be lovers and now they're stuck on this expedition together and they can't be, and then everyone, and then the other element is that it annoys everybody else. So I just said, I'll start that in there. And that ended up blowing up a bunch of stuff because once you set those, it's like, what are those balls where you drop the one and it sets?
Yeah, those like pendulum.
Not the pendulum, but the one. Well, yeah, the ones with multiple balls
like
that you drop one and
Yeah, I don't
Yeah,
know what they're
yeah. And if you
called, but
drop two, then two come off the other end. I
yeah,
don't know what they're called.
it's
Um,
Chekhov's gun
but
of
once you
relationship
start,
drama.
right, right. Well, because once you start one thing like that, it will often, if you like let it go and see where it goes, it'll like start going, taking on a life of its own. So then that began to develop. Then it was like, well, why did the relationship end? So then I had to start thinking about that. And then their backstory started developing. And then, of course, in revision, you can go back and fix all the setup that you missed because you were coming up with it as you went, right? Um, but that's how, and then so in kind of like we're stumping along, right? Then that adds a little local color to the stumping along, you
It
know,
creates a
Mhm.
little bit more investment in like what's
right?
happening,
Mhm.
and
In the investment, and
that
it gives
that
you
distracts from the fact that it's like they're on this quest and they have to go from point A to point B to point C, etc.
right. And then,
Is really
yeah. Yeah. And then you kind of, and then you also have to think about where do I need action scenes? And one of the things that's interesting, one of the things my editor asked for in revisions was, can you make the scene where Lord Dwen arrives, and I won't say more, I won't give any details, and more or less does a citizen's arrest of our heroine, right? And he said, my editor said, can you make her feel that she is more in imminent peril, as opposed to, so evidently the first draft it was more like, this sucks. So I kind of pumped that up, oh my God, what if they just, stab me through the heart right now? Right, that kind of thing. So there's more of a sense of imminent peril. So you have to kind of combine we're walking along, and we're going on a long journey, and parts of the journey are just we're walking along, there's nothing happening, and then like, well, where's a little bit of, could be a little bit of peril, or what's that over there, or anything to kind of like break that, or we find some terrible, we find a corpse and that really sucks, plus it has repercussions in other ways. So, and you kind of put them in at the point where things might start to flag. So that's why it's an art.
yeah, and
Absolutely.
that's why fucked
Yeah.
up chat GPT and other area stuff.
Yeah.
And like, because
Yeah.
you never, if you don't practice these things, if you don't experiment, like the fact that
Mhm.
you experimented with YA and published this YA trilogy, that just writing in that different genre taught you so much about pacing that you could then apply to all the stuff that you write afterwards. It's
So
amazing.
much. Everything we do, everything we write, even the stuff we write that doesn't work out, maybe especially that,
Yeah.
everything we do is grist for the mill. It helps us. It's all worthwhile writing.
No
And that's a
wasted
beautiful,
words.
beautiful note to end on. No wasted words. Also, I looked up, it's called it's like a Newton's
Oh, yeah.
Newton's cradle is what it's
Newton's
called.
Is
cradle.
that what it's called?
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's like 5 balls.
Yeah,
It's kind of
we've all
basically like
seen
5
them.
pendulums, but it's called
Yeah.
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 Newton's cradle. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So thanks, Newton. We appreciate you.
We do appreciate Newton.
We
AI
appreciate you.
could not have done what Newton did.
No, hell no. And we appreciate you, Kate, and for doing this with us. But just to close out, I have a 2-parter for you. If you can, you've already given
Okay.
a ton of good advice, but a good bit of soundbite writing advice, and then B, tell us a weird or random fact that you find to be utterly fascinating.
So I actually did my homework, kind of. My best piece of writing advice is figure out what works for you. I am not into the people who say, this is what you should do. No, figure out what works for you. And the corollary is, and what works for you for this particular project, because sometimes you need different things. Sometimes a different thing will write a different way, or you'll need something different for it. But, all the writing stuff is great because you can take it all in and figure out what works for you. And it doesn't have to be the same as what works for someone else.
Fantastic advice.
Perfect.
A weird or random fact. Oh my gosh. I really struggle with questions like this. Quite honestly, I really struggle with questions like this. And because I can't think of one thing as soon as you say, what's one book you like? Oh, I don't know. There's a lot of books over there. Okay. I was gonna make a general thing about how amazing humans are, that way they can come up. They're so ingenious and artistic and come up with all this stuff. But when I went around to look there, I looked and I saw the Alexander. So I did a lot of research into Alexander the Great. And one thing that I had never known, I don't know how fascinating I found this, but this is just about history and what we're taught and what we're not taught. So it turns out, so Alexander the Great, as we know, conquered half the world and then died young, because whatever. I could talk for another hour about Alexander the Great, but I won't. So he was the son of Philip, who arguably was not even arguably, Philip was a better king than Alexander ever was.
He set Alexander up for all of his greatness.
He did. I mean, Alexander did a lot. But he was a good conqueror, but he never was really a good king. But Philip was, like you did in those times, he had a lot of different wives because you married people for alliances. So I had never known until I started doing research that I knew we all learn about Alexander's half-brother, Philip Aridaeus, who becomes king after Alexander dies. Sorry, spoiler, Alexander dies. But we hear about him because he becomes king later and because he's a man and because he had some kind of a disability that nobody's quite sure what it is, so that he couldn't really become king on his own and all this stuff. But Alexander had a couple of sisters, including a full sister, Cleopatra, who became, and then two others. There's one or two others. Thessaloniki. Is there a third one? Anyway, but Alexander had an older half sister named Kainane. I might be pronouncing that wrong, who I had never heard of. I had never read anything about her until I actually got a lot of stuff about it. And she doesn't even show up in many books about Alexander. She doesn't even show up in most books about Alexander. She's Philip's oldest child. She's the daughter of an Illyrian princess that Philip married in the early years when he needed to make an alliance with Illyria, because he was trying to hold off other Illyrian tribes, but also the Greeks, because of course we're in Macedonia. In Illyria, royal princesses learned to fight. I don't mean that they played around. I mean they fought on the battlefield, because it was more the plains, more nomadic, more steppe nomad, that cultural zone where we know that women bore arms, and rode to war. How commonly, I don't know, but we know that they were buried with armor and that they had this tradition that the queens rode to war. So Alexander had an older half sister who was trained to war by her mother, who I had not. I resent the fact that I didn't know that.
Yeah.
And until so late. And
she's the firstborn too.
And she's the firstborn. And I'm sure she would have been fine as queen. Anyway, she was married to Philip's nephew, who he supplanted. So his older brother's son, who was a young boy when that father died in battle. And so Philip said, and Macedonia had that, like the oldest adult male of the line usually takes over, because they're a warlike society. So you need someone who can lead the troops. Yeah. So, and he didn't kill his son, which was, not that often happened. Oops. You had to not let that thing. But so he married, Alexander later killed his cousin and so he married his daughter to this nephew, which suggests that Philip may have been fond of his brother, that he didn't want to kill his brother's son. Anyway, they had one child who was a girl, Eurydice or Aurea, who was raised by her mother to fight on the battlefield. And when Alexander died, Kainane marched out with her daughter to try to whatever. She ended up being killed in a battle. But it was her daughter, who was then 16 at the time, who spoke in front of the Macedonian army and said, who married Philip Aridaeus, her cousin, or that's complicated. That gets complicated, doesn't it? I guess cousin,
Some
something.
familiar relationship.
Some a little too close.
Don't look
familiar
at it too
relationship.
closely. The chins are fine.
Yeah, and she gave a whole speech to the Macedonian army and said, well, you have to go with the Argead, you can't let somebody else, and so the army said, yes, raise Philip Aridaeus. So here's a whole history that just got left out.
Yeah.
And it's recorded by the Romans. That's why we know about it. So that's why we have to think a lot about history and what's left out and what's left in.
Yeah.
I love that.
Amazing.
I'd watch that movie.
I love like learning about ancient history like this. So I'm definitely going to take a little dive into it. Well, fantastic, Kate. Thank you so much for chatting with Greta and I today, for sharing just a bounty of wonderful experiences and advice and everything like that.
Thank you so much for having me on.
We really appreciate it. Absolute pleasure. As well, if you contribute to our Patreon at $5 or more each month, you can check out a reading from Kate by Kate from her new novel, The Witch Roads, which is out today. Make sure to go get yourself a copy. And Kate, if you could please let everyone know where they can find you online.
I have a website called either kateelliott.com, 2 L's, 2 T's, or imakeupworlds.com. They go to the same place. And I'm on Blue Sky at Kate Elliott SFF. And
awesome.
I think that's it.
Instagram too? Yeah.
I'm technically on Instagram, but I never post. I only use it to follow certain people who I don't see elsewhere.
Well, you can follow Kate there if you feel like it. So. As well, you can check out SFF Addicts across the board at SFF Addicts Pod. You can find me at Adrian M. Gibson. You can go buy Mushroom Blues in all formats, wherever you can find books. Greta, what about you?
Yeah, I'm at Greta K. Kelly on Instagram, TikTok, and a little bit on Twitter. And you can get my books wherever you buy books, including my most recent one, The Queen of Days, which is, a bunch of thieves with more swagger than sense trying to rob a god, as one does.
As one does. And that's it for this episode. Stay tuned next week for part 2 with Kate for our masterclass on bringing politics into SFF. For now, keep reading, keep imagining, and we'll see you next time on SFF Addicts.